I was just hit by a expansive thought. A little bit more accurate than a deep thought. Deep is a bit self-aggrandizing too. My thoughts come in like fractal packets, and they hit with like a core idea, and then if I sit with them, they may unfold like blooming lotus petals. So there's a lot of talk of multiverses and parallel timelines and things like that. And obviously this has been around conceptually in physics for a really long time. And then if you expand your view broad enough to consider that perhaps some of the wisdom teachings from ancient mystic cultures and traditions have something to do with some understanding, perhaps not at a mathematical quantum physical level, but at a tangible phenomenological level of like the fractal nature of reality. We can synthesize, modern sources and or postmodern sources and ancient sources and arrive at some interesting conclusions which may not be commonly agreed upon yet, but may be really worth investigating and are appealing to me for like the cosmological world building of my literary fiction. Because I'm inclined to think they might be true, that there's a sliver of chance that in a probabilistic universe this might probabilistically be approaching accurate, but I digress. I'm going to oversimplify it in order to like convey the concept, but understand that the oversimplification represents a level of complexity in order of magnitudes that's fractally huge and mind-boggling. Thus, the simplification. Imagine that I represent, like I'm speaking of myself. But I'm not trying to be, self-aggrandizing or making claims about myself in any shape or form. I'm speaking of myself in the theoretical, fictional abstract, as if I were Goofy from a Disney cartoon, one of those old school shorts where they're like explaining something, and Goofy's sort of like the floating person in the living diorama where they explain the thing. I don't know if you remember those cartoons. They're really old school, and there was a specific series, and I don't remember what the full explanation was, but there was a full let's take a look at this slice of life. And then there's Goofy making something in the kitchen, or Goofy skiing down a mountain or whatever. And then they like cut away, and then he kind of breaks the fourth wall and stuff. So imagine that I'm someone who's somewhat theoretically conscious in a metaphysically pragmatic way of parallel selves, right? And let's call them me, myself, and I, and we'll limit it to a set of three. Let's say I'm aware that there's me, there's myself over there in a parallel universe, and I, for lack of a better designation, over there in another parallel universe. And to each of them, or each of us, I feel like I'm me. And like that, I am the central I. Each of them, let us say, colloquially speaking, can argue that they feel like the center of the universe, right? And there is some math to this. I forget the thesis and the theory and the context in which I came across this, but I remember very clearly seeing a mathematical explanation once using satellite imagery overlays from like different positions. So in other words, using two images to create a stereoscopic view in 2D. The universe is such, apparently, that observationally, any point in it would appear from that perspective, from its own perspective, to be apparently the observable center of the universe. Thus, the ego mind, to a certain extent. I don't think that it was caused or created by this phenomena, but I think this physics phenomena is true. Every individual feels like the center of their own phenomenological field, in part because they are. They're not technically, like, if I'm in Wyoming, I'm not the center of the state of Wyoming because I'm, in some corner or whatever, right? I'm not the geographical center. But even geospacically, like if you stop thinking in terms of where things are located in relative position to each other on planet Earth, and start thinking in the totality of the visible universe, understanding that the visible bubble, because it is sort of like a virtual bubble of that which we can see must be sitting amidst that which we cannot observe yet because of the limits of the travel of light and information and whatnot, which is apparently all measurably expanding. We don't need to get into the arguments about whether or not or why it shouldn't be or whatever. It appears to be observably expanding, and depending on where you're standing at a cosmological level, like if we're standing here from our perspective near our home on Earth, let's say we were floating above, safely away, the massive, supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy, but somewhere, quote, north, because what is north in space, but somewhere, quote, north of it, safely away, and we're standing there, and that was generally our visual central reference point, like, I am here, standing on top of the galaxy. All other galaxies appear to be rapidly speeding away from us. But if you and I, or me, whatever, the perspective, the character that we're following, were to suddenly be at some galaxy far flung away, like, let's say at least 2/3 across the known expanse of the visible universe, instantaneously, without having to age or suffer through tedium, and we settle ourselves in the exact same relative position to that galaxy, regardless of size. It may look bigger, it may look smaller, but we're relatively speaking in the same position north of it. And we took measurements and did scientific studies from that position. It would appear as if every other visible galaxy and or structure is moving away from us there. For whatever reason, this is an inherently occurring reality of sacred geometric, algorithmic, fractal mathematics. A fractal, for those who may or may not have the definition right at the tip of their tongue, no judgments. To the best of my understanding, I'm not reading from a textbook. I'm telling you what I understand it based on, years of looking into it and thinking about it as a layperson, as a plain old regular Joe Schmo. A fractal is an infinite, self-referencing, self-repeating holographic. In other words, it's not an endpoint hologram like a 30-foot Snoop Dogg dancing over some stage. It's holographic in its very nature, its very structure, its very form and function. It is a hologram at all, but it is holographic, more importantly, right? So, and in the case of the universe, living, which is to some people a bit beyond the realm of reason to them, but there's plenty of evidence for it. It's just living at a different scale and level of complexity than we are traditionally accepted as a thing. But it is a thing, right? If we are alive and we came of the universe manifested us. Let's not quibble about which theory. Those are just our theories. Whatever happened, here we are, and we came from somewhere here. And there may be complicated other levels to it, but I digress. Barring any ridiculous theory that insists the artificiality of this reality versus some external reality, blah, blah, blah. Those are all like Occam's razors, too many levels of silly, in my opinion. And arguably, any and all simulation theory, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, any and all simulation theory, if it's real and if it's artificial, in other words, this isn't being done by some organic process, but rather a computer box somewhere, an Xbox game of some other race, some other creature, some other sentient being somewhere. And it is indeed, by what we can observe, intended to be a fairly accurate model of what would be a fairly realistic, naturally occurring cosmology with some really interesting and borderline mysterious components to it that point towards the transcendental. And if that simulation is, theoretically speaking, intended to be accurate in regards to replicating the reality which inspired it, as opposed to being a complete fabricated fiction, right? Once we get into that territory, it gets even harder to comprehend like what we're even doing here. But I digress. Ultimately, even if it's visually dramatically different, there must be some core thing about it that renders this simulation an attempt to replicate the external reality Therefore, the external reality must also have this transcendental component. Therefore, transcendentalism continues to be some tool worth investigating, even if we're a simulation. But generally speaking, I'm not in that camp. And because I went off on that tangent, I don't even remember what I was talking about. Spirals and like my actual like fractal thought about parallel realities. Because everything is part of the universe, right? Let's whatever the physical, visible universe is, let's acknowledge that the word we're using in this context here for this conversation is intended to openly and with everyone sort of hopefully realizing it, include anything and everything else that we may have not figured out yet, right? Because in the scientifically accurate chart of the shit we know versus the shit we don't know and the layers of not knowing it, the sliver of what we know versus all the other slices of things we don't know and things we don't know that we don't know is tiny by comparison. So let's just include them, right? Here's what I think, from my understanding, it's a theory, and I've had experiences that have led me to this theory. As of yet, I'm not claiming to have like rigorously documented me confirming the theory, right? I'm totally an armchair theorist. I have no notebooks. I'm not even like OCD crazy person theorist with like, this is it. What you're listening to is the extent to which I've managed to scrape it all together. I'm not. Most of the time it's just me daydreaming or having, deep thoughts or weird experiences that can only be explained by the components of the theory. To simplify what is a very complex, multifaceted, multidimensional, multi-spectrum phenomena, our experiential life, the movie we're watching that is fully immersive in 3D, because I do like analogies that decouple us from reality a little bit, only for perspective, not to be taken literally. We are not as isolated as we imagine or perceive ourselves to be, because it is the same I, the same central nodal point or singularity of consciousness that perceives itself to be at the center of a universe, that is at the center of the skull, right? Whatever you call yourself me about, whatever you point to, when you say that silly gag, that whatever you describe it as, who's a person that's got a crazy theory and two thumbs? This guy, right? Like whenever you point at yourself, whenever you self-identify, whatever your identity is, because the root anchor of it is before the identity, right? Like you construct an identity beyond the scope of your actual consciousness. The root center of yourself, that central place that's vacuuming in all the sensory data and all the thoughts and things of wherever they come from, that appears to be, it feels, and it's an illusion. It's not fake, it's an illusion. It's something that is other than what it appears to be at first blush. That's what illusion means. It's still real. Magic is real. It's just not what happens isn't what you think you saw happen. But it's not a lie. It's just a different story is being told to your sensory apparatus than is being executed to tell the story. But I digress. There's this illusion that we're trapped inside our skull. But what meditation cultures from around the world tell us is that there's a universe within ourselves, right? That there's a universe of universes within ourselves. Because the universe is a fractal, even if you don't want to talk about mysticism, the universe is a fractal. Measure things enough and you'll go, oh shit, you're right. Measure a coastline and you'll be like, well, darn it, if that isn't just nothing but fractal mathematics. Watch the what do you call it? The stop motion time-lapse photography of seeds sprouting and drilling into the dirt and sprouting out and reaching up for the sun. It's fractal in its algorithmic circular dance. Spiderwebs, fractals, everything in nature is a fractal. Even things that are lumpy and square or angular and whatever, to have gotten to the shape that they've gotten to, for the human body to be the weird, interesting diversity and array of human bodies that the genome expresses, it took fractal algorithmic mathematics to to achieve the building blocks and to comprise the complexity. I mean, just look at a genome. We've sequenced and 3D modeled the human genome that is somehow an individual, but also impossibly in unison, acting as one hive collective entity in the billions of cells that are human in the human body, right? Set aside the reality that there are also millions, if not billions, of cells that are in the human body doing important things that are not human genomes. That's a whole nother issue. But like, you look at any cell, they're doing different things. They form different shapes, but the genome somehow is the exact same genome, except for one mutation. Obviously, there's exceptions to these statements, but let's not go run up barking up those trees for no reason. In a healthy functioning genome from two different cells, despite the function and location and structure and and shape and whatever might differentiate the cells, the genome at the heart of those cells, driving those cells, telling those cells somehow without language what to do, using mathematics, it's fractal, and they're all somehow magically, synchronously doing everything that it takes to make a cohesive being without a brain and without, like, each individual cell doesn't have a neuron connection to each other individual cell so that the genomes can talk somehow, right? And yet, and if you were just to look at one strand, one whole complete unit of what the genome is, and you render it in 3D in high def that you can expand it and look at it and turn it around, boom, it's all fractals. Okay, given that, the mind must be fractal in its form, function, nature, and everything else. So, how do parallel universes work really? I'm disinclined to buy into anything that's like linear in its formulation, right? Parallel universes may be simply summarized as like, twins that are, following different paths, and so you'll draw linear things. But if you want to get really accurate, the universe hardly ever follows straight lines. Sure, we can see straight lines everywhere. I'm not saying that we can't. And yes, an animal will appear to walk in a straight line. I'm not saying that they don't. But I'm saying that the universe inherently, because of its form and fractal algorithmic nature, works with spirals as its primary tool sets in different ways, in different functions, and in different scales, in different levels and dimensions. So let's pause and remember something. It's a really important pin on the corkboard. Language is never enough. That's why we invented math. And math is, while increasingly accurate, is still not really enough. We can accurately describe something mathematically and still be like, well, bugger me if I understand what it actually is, does, and how it works and why it is, right? We can describe all the visual phenomena and physical phenomena that we can now observe, observable phenomena about a black hole, but darn it if we really understand what's going on beyond our event horizon, okay? Language, symbolic systems fail. They have their own liminal boundary because they are created by not just the mind. They're not created by consciousness. Consciousness does not need language of any kind. Consciousness doesn't even need symbols. It's processing raw reality, right? But the post-processes that are the various levels of distilling consciousness into what we commonly refer to the ego mind, and all the various complicated, it's not one thing, it's an array, it's a cascading waterfall of various systems that render our ultimate little tiny cool experience of being me and my body talking about myself and wondering about things whilst my body does things that I even know consciousness of, right? Each of those contextualized body avatar phenomena are drawing or connected to, conjoined with a consciousness that permeates reality at a dimension that isn't dimensional. If I can put it that way. So the singularity is all the points, and is coalescing through really complicated multi-dimensional layered procedures of algorithmic fractal infolding, unfolding, outfolding, and through-folding, because there's multiple formats of folding. The fractal algorithms, to sort of condense reality. As one old school meme points out, matter is just energy that's like condensed into this state of appearing to feel solid. Put a pin on all that. We've discussed it before in the show. We'll discuss it again. Here's what I want to talk about, like parallel universes. Let's limit our example to 3. There's an infinite array, right? 1, I am born. You are born. 1 is born. And there's an infinite array of parallel universes in which, and there's divergent sets of divergent qualities too. For weird example, while we're only going to talk about 3 to keep the ultimate discussion really simple, remember it's an infinite unfolding array, and it's diverging from centerline, if you can call one focal point of like I am born and you live your life. If there is such a thing as a centerline, all the variants are prone to be varying away from them. They're all doing it in a sublimated, kind of hard to detect spiral fashion, because although you walk in a straight line and your life feels linear through time, the full phenomena of your singular individuation into one of these timelines is highly cyclical in nature. You're just not measuring and trying to observe it that way. Therefore, it's not very common that people notice it. And obviously a lot of it is sort of invisible spiraling. Now, there's sort of like various axes upon which variance will diverge away. And it's common, for example, for people to have a visual image of like an infinite hallway of mirrors of doppelgangers. But thanks to some intelligent folks out there in pop culture, we now also understand, as in the case with, for example, crocodile or alligator Loki, that there will be parallel universes in the infinite spectrum of variance away from whatever the theoretical through line is, in which wild cards will diverge and create their own branches of divergence and convergence. So you won't be identical twins in every universe. And in fact, even the identical twins will have a tendency to diverge from one another in likeness until you reach some liminal proximity of divergence and exploring the variety within the confines of whatever the individuation pattern may be. Because if there's one through line to the entire form, function, architectural structuring, and like visible evidence and invisible evidence of the universe, it is that, as is stated in what the definition of a fractal is, it is infinitely exploring diversity through a constant permutation of its main ingredients and all of the ingredients it creates. I digress. Reducing it back down to like a set example of 3. If you imagine that somehow I managed to make inner consciousness, awareness connections to my 2 closest neighbors on either side of me, to keep it really simple. There's neighbors ebbing and flowing in every possible direction of your individual through line, in every possible imaginable dimensional way you could compass it, to make a compass a verb. But to keep the example simple, we've identified 3, right? Or 2, for a total of 3. Each of them will feel to be the center one. And they will perceive the rest of us on either side, because of that whole center of perception thing. And in terms of any discernible calling or trajectory or goal or thing that could be manifested. Arguably, one of the interesting things that has been floating around forever and is getting a postmodern sort of rediscovery, I think, at least I feel like, is that of consciously or unconsciously, organically or through willpower, like coincidentally or intentionally, causing or discovering or somehow facilitating a convergence of timelines. Well, the simplest way to imagine it is, a singularity point bifurcating into 3 points that stray away from one another until awareness is achieved, and then efforts are made to sort of realign so that the trajectory points are a convergence. But we know from geometry, two parallel lines will travel forever and never connect. And arguably, there are through lines that are other central through lines that create other probability waveform toroidal shitstorms or tornadoes of other variance and probability waveform expression that sort of accordion out in octaves. And each is their own kaleidoscope collection of bundles of things that are interconnected and related to whatever the through line is that varies from your through line. And that repeats itself on many levels, not just the individual. But that's a whole level of complexity that gets really hard to begin to narrate, never mind to depict visually or imagine visually. So if 3 mutually identified parallel selves encounter synchronicities in their understanding of each other's life contexts, vis-a-vis whatever methodologies, dreams or sort of daydreamy, precoggy feeling, deja vu type overlay imagery, which is sort of the phenomena I'm most personally familiar with. Deja vu was never what people told me deja vu was, but I also could understand why they would describe it that way. The thing that I kept experiencing that was a real life, legitimate, like, what is this phenomena? It has both an internal, difficult to identify physiological sensory component, as well as like an audio-visual component in which my sensory processing of my AV inputs radically shifts it in modality and appears to present, for lack of better terminology, to whatever is perceiving it differently than it does under quote-unquote normal conditions. And it's a lifetime worth of trying to describe that to arrive at those sentences. And I don't know if they even are clear enough for some who may not be able to relate directly from personal experience. But to put it in more graphic terms, the most concise, and it's an allegorical, figurative statement. It's like a symbolic statement, not really a clean. I could never describe it in English. What I just said just now was even better than what I'm going to say now, I think. But this is for the visual learners. When I've experienced deja vu, right, it has not been like in the movies, especially not like when in The Matrix they talk about deja vu, but that is a whole nother discussion to be had. Put a pin on the wall about the word Matrix and about the film Matrix and about what I've got to say about the two. And the postmodern use of the term Matrix vis-a-vis the idea that we've got to escape it. That's a whole third pin. Up on the corkboard, please. The corkboard is now tangibly real and has sparkly lights on it. It's not just been used live on cam yet. I digress. The Matrix is the fractal itself, right? So just to clarify that. We can't escape it. That'd be like chopping our way out of the egg that we're hatching from before we're ready to hatch. Problematic choice there, friends. But coming back. If we tried to, the three of us, in this attempt to converge our previously divergent timelines and phenomenological experiences, if we exclusively thought about it and strategically chose our actions and behaviors and and practices around it, thinking in purely linear terms, it would be a tough slog, as some might say. It would be a difficult uphill battle. It would be a bit like, what's his name, rolling that stone up a hill forever. If we incorporated an what's the golden spiral name? A logarithmic spiral construct, and we understood that we were in our own spirals, but that if we find synchronicities, those are moments when our spirals are sort of approaching convergence in the epic curvature of their arc, which is broader and softer and gentler and subtler than we might imagine, which is why it's easy to sort of detach from it and feel like it's a straight line. You can build a circle big enough that the wall you're walking along line may elusively feel like a straight line, even though it clearly has a curve to it, right? It has to be a really epically off big circle, but I digress. And of course, cosmologically speaking, metaphysically speaking, like human typical scale structures are irrelevant because we're talking about transdimensional structures. As any two parallel identities of the same like person in two similar but somewhat different interrelated universal lives in their own timelines approach, there'll be this rush of like synergistic understanding, expression, blah blah, various symptomologies, and there will be a peak period where there'll be like, well, different sets of phenomena that if you aren't approaching it mindfully, consciously, and with intent, it'll just be weird, curious things, and it won't make any sense, and you won't think much of it. But if you see them for what they are, they'll be powerful. And arguably, it's in those moments that we can commune, for lack of a better term, and I do not mean in words. I mean in like metaphysical energy and other vibratory methods, in order to harmonize our two spirals so that contact points like that, or synchronicity alignments like that, increase, bringing, if you imagine the spiral like a long stretch out slinky cord, you know that you can like line up the slinky cord, two slinky cords, so that if you line them up just right, they'll spring together and appear like one slinky cord, right? Okay. And if you do it wrong, it'll cause tangles, and you could really jank up a whole slinky. You know how you can tangle a slinky with itself? Imagine instead of two slinkies, you have one slinky, and you've spread it out, and then at the center, you've pinned it, and then you've brought the two ends up really far. It's all laying on the floor, and you brought the two ends out really far, and then squished them together, and squished the two coils together until they almost line up. If you don't do it right, and you get lumps and chinks and blah, and then you let it snap back together, it'll be a god-awful mess. But if you do it just right, they'll line up and then hopefully slide back apart together without much problem. That taking them apart may be impossible. Now, that isn't mathematically accurate. That was just a mechanical, slinky, visual, two-dimensional aid. Although a slinky is three-dimensional, relative to what I'm talking about, we might as well flatten it down and call it a two-dimensional explanation for a multi-dimensional phenomena. But working with that, imagine that there is a sort of ligature moment, but instead of one slinky bent on itself, it's multiple independent slinkies that start at the same point, and that point is bonded. And that point is like the birth of the individuated mind fractal that then begins to diverge because of contextual probability waveform function quantum mechanical physics that demands that the two phenomena that created by choices and interacting with circumstances creates a phenomenological field that must be played out. In the simplest terms, yes and no answers are both lived out. The cat is alive and the cat is dead. And the histories that would play out from those events afterwards are made manifest, just not in a way that's tangible to each other. Right? So all the slinking coils extend from one unity that is the individuated fractal branch, because there's branching going on in the state before this that reaches a flesh body avatar being and then represents one embodiment. And then the physical reality explores all the possible outcomes of that embodiment's life. If you can identify, and this is all very not sufficient enough language, please keep that in mind. But if you can work through metaphysical practices, meditation primarily, and other things, to commune wordlessly with your neighboring selves in the parallel, quote-unquote, universe live probability waveform function tunnels of their experiential phenomena that are already, for whatever reason, on a convergent path with you, you can build momentum and accumulate a cohesive synergizing so that those convergence happen in a non-chaotic way, which builds more momentum and attraction to the other neighboring, so if the three that we first identify approach convergence, they start pulling other three around them towards that convergence. Now, let's step back. A person is born and they never become aware of this information or of this possibility, this theory. They never engage in any meditation practices. They never, they're an atheist. They never study any spiritual nothing, blah. They just live their lives as they are, as the situation unfolds in front of them, and the context and the triggers, evoke, the feedback loop that becomes their behavior and their life patterns, etc. They're still generating multiple selves, right? This is not a belief caused phenomena. This is physics. The particle waveform will behave like a particle and a waveform until it confronts the contexts that disambiguate it, and it needs to be observed as either a particle or a waveform. It remains both. That's the tricky part. All of this is holographic in nature. So no parallel life is mutually exclusive of any other than we can only physically perceive ourselves. And if we limit our thinking and our perceptions, because perceptions can be limited, we can make ourselves go blind through pure mental effort, as has been documented medically in some times. I have no references. I apologize. That may be complete nonsense. I may just be making that up for the fiction of the story. Keep that in mind. This is WAPAD Wednesdays. Organically, these trajectories, these complex compound algorithmic spiral trajectories of these individuals can converge and diverge and intertwine and inform one another even without conscious awareness of it, right? When you experience high synchronicity in your life or weird levels of like precog deja vu-ish synchronicity, like flash forward-y, flashbacky things, it's because there's like the hallway of mirror. Here's one way to again create an allegorical analogous visual symbol that helps sort of non-language comprehension. When those coils of those slinky chains, that's not even a great way to describe them, but each of those slinky spirals is one fractal recursive iteration of you, right? And now, mind you, each one's going to be bifurcating into their own little spirals because you make one big choice in life, like go to this school, go to that school, move to that state, stay in this town, blah, blah, blah. Each of those things branch off a thing. And then, wake up at 10, wake up at midnight, wake up, have toast for breakfast. Even the mundane things, even the things you think are inconsequential, if there could have been alternative outcomes, they're being expressed by the infinite fractal foamy tornado of probabilistic manifestation, because consciousness is infinite. It's not about any, material limitations. The material reality exists in the fractal, toroidal, cosmic, holographic mind imaginarium of that which, whatever is the highest tier level of the cosmic egg mind, that is this living, conscious, divine uterus that is gestating all of the life forms expressed in the virtual holographic material density of the yolk, which is being created by the mind being, which is sort of like the infinitely dispersed unity, if you can imagine that, a unity that isn't a singular point, that bring about the very egg and its shell and its yolk into existence. Strange analogy. So these convergences and divergences can happen unconsciously. And that might be why chaos storms happen in our lives, and why synchronicity alignment storms, for lack of an inverse opposite label word, also happen in our lives. If you add to it the conscious effort, the meditative, mindful effort of communing and healing the differences, the gaps, the damages, the traumas engendered by the choices made in ourselves and in our parallel lives, and in the conscious communal effort of our multiple selves to foster, encourage, generate, cultivate. There's no one word that really contains what is actually going on, but to sort of, for lack of any other better term, manifest collectively an ever-increasing spiral convergence, harmonic, cascading series of events that ultimately lead to things that we may not even be able to anticipate or describe, but are implicitly involved in all those things that we discuss when we talk about enlightenment and awakening. If there is any awakening in the matrix, which is the uterus that's gestating you, it is that, not some escaping of it. Rather, a preparedness to be given birth, which ultimately would mean, if we continue the egg analogy, what does an egg, any egg, whether it's a chicken egg or a human egg, what does it do? It is a massive, singular, self-contained whole that bifurcates infinitely. It splits itself into an infinite array of varying, interconnected cells, right? In which at the center of each there is this holographic, fractal, algorithmic genome that's telepathically communicating, for lack of a better term, telepathically conducting the organization of all bodily activities, right, into one cohesive cell, one cohesive being that is a whole much greater than any of its component parts added up. If we take that analogy, the entire universe can be seen as a process of this turmoil towards an ultimate reunification in some form, which is probably incomprehensible, unpredictable, and indescribable as of yet, until we transcend language and begin to commune at whatever higher order form of communication exists beyond, the wagging of tongues, to put it, in a colloquial way. But I digress and come to a rest, friends. I've shared enough. That was the concept, which I want to then integrate into the literature, right? Like, a lot of what I'm writing is action interspersed with someone explaining to someone else the things that Mr. Zeppo has explained to them, which independently may or may not all make sense, but add up to all the reasoning as to why he's doing this ridiculous thing that he's doing. Pins on the corkboard. Check it out. Visit sprecher.com/show/Zencast and or any of the other lovely podcast platforms the show is available, and start digging through all the episodes to piece the pieces together. Thank you for listening to this rough draft Wattpad Wednesdays fictional weaving, world building, narrative explainer of what's going on in my mind and in the world in which the characters I harbor in my mind exist, what they're doing, and why it matters to them, and why I think if we take it all as one big salt rock of an analogy, it may matter to us. I humbly thank you for tuning in. Until next time, I have been the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo, working here in a moment of genuine inspiration for Wattpad Wednesdays. Tune in for all the other segments of the show, and of course visit the other dimensions of the Zeppoverse that I keep talking about by heading over to Solo.to/Mr. Zeppo. May peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your hearts. And remember to go out there into the world and be good humans to each other. Peace.